and we want to avoid it. So how are we going to deal with this? One of the ways we'll deal with it is to look at two complementary frameworks. One is linking risk assessment, which we've heard about, and risk perception. We've also heard about that in terms of combining them for risk management. We have a framework here that starts with identifying the risk, working our way through, prioritizing the risks, assessing the risks, and then finding ways to manage the risks and deal with them and implement them. And implementation is critical here. Thinking Fast and Slow, Daniel Kahneman's book, on which the session is sort of based on, links intuitive and deliberative thinking and raises questions on how we do that, and particularly in dealing with extreme events. And so we have these two aspects, intuitive thinking in System 1, sort of nicknamed that, in the context of people thinking very, very quickly, does very well for normal decisions, very poorly for extreme events and catastrophic events, and that's what we're going to focus on in this session. Prior to disaster, what do? We bury our heads in the sand and say, it's not going to happen to me. We don't have to worry about it. We don't have to take any action at all because of the fact that it is somewhere in the very, very low probability event. After a disaster, we behave just the oppositely. We say, basically, we have to protect ourselves. We have to take measures. We have to do something in order to be able to deal with that. That's our behavioral process. A few years later, we say, it's not going to happen to me. People buy insurance, they cancel their policy several years later because they haven't had a claim. They don't celebrate the best return is no return at all. And so we should highlight the fact that we should take these measures and celebrate. Most important, myopia, short-term horizons, where we actually say, unless I get a return tomorrow or the next day or next year, I'm not necessarily going to want to invest in these measures. And as a result, we don't take these actions now. Global interdependencies are critical here. What happens in one part of the world is going to have enormous impact with respect to the rest of the world, and we have to pay attention to those interconnectedness, which we've all talked about and heard about in some of the other sessions. One weak link can disrupt the entire chain. And as a result, we have to ask ourselves, how do we avoid the problems if something happens and we are not protected? What can we do to avoid that? Here's an example of what happened to the automobile industry and a number of companies. After the earthquake in Japan, there were a whole set of supply chain disruptions, and many firms only had one source of supply, and as a result, they really were in a position where they couldn't act and couldn't take steps. So, a simple example, of course, here is outsourcing to several suppliers to figure out a way that you can protect yourself in the way of actually making sure that you have others that can actually help you if one of them goes under. This is a tightrope here, taking the steps beforehand in order to avoid the disaster occurring afterwards. Do we put the money in now to protect ourselves? And the answer is, how do we make this an attractive option for everyone to see this as a positive way of acting? Well, one way to do this, and we'll talk about this in the session, is provide short-term economic incentives and make them such so that people will want to engage in long-term strategies and long-term thinking. And this is the real challenge, the long-term strategies. Regulations and standards that are well enforced, we want to make sure that in some sense people are trying to avoid them. And we know what can happen if it turns out that these regulations are not actually followed. And here, of course, is an example we're all very familiar with the BP oil spill, where steps could have been taken beforehand, and yet as a result of that, we found that there were enormous impacts as a result. So that's what we're going to do in this session. It's going to be an interactive one. We need all of you to join. Scott Belden from Travelers, Margaret Hanoi from the World Economic Forum, my colleague Erwan Michel Kajan from the Risk Management Center, and Alex Wittenberg from Oliver Wyman. It will be an interactive session. We'll start off with some interactive aspects, and we look forward to having you all with us. Thank you.